So suddenly, what is the need for this kind of a deal to come where you are saying aggression against either of this is aggression against both? That's like almost like a NATO kind of a wording.
After the Israeli strikes on Qatar, it became very clear that if a state that hosts the largest US base in the Middle East cannot be protected from unilateral, unprecedented Israeli strikes on an urban residential area in the capital city of an Arab country, then that categorically forces all other Arab states in the region to reassess the fundamentals of their security. This sort of an agreement with the Pakistanis was arguably a low-hanging fruit.
Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm G. Sampath. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have signed a new defense deal. It's called the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, and under this deal, any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. There are also vague indications that Saudi Arabia will get the benefit of Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, but in what form, whether through a nuclear umbrella or through sale purchase, is not clear. So far, we have seen two kinds of reactions to this deal. On the one hand, are the alarmists who are saying this is the beginning of a quote-unquote Muslim NATO in the Gulf, and on the other side are those who say it's no big deal and it doesn't really change anything so far as India is concerned. So what triggered this deal in the first place? What's in it for Saudi Arabia, which is already under the US security blanket? And what does this deal mean for India? What does this mean vis-a-vis our tensions with Pakistan? And what does it mean for our relations with Saudi Arabia? Joining us today is Bashir Ali Abbas, Senior Research Associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi. Bashir, welcome to InFocus. Thank you so much for joining us. To start with, I wanted to ask you about the history of security cooperation between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. This deal, I'm guessing, did not happen out of the blue. So there has been some kind of security cooperation or partnership between the two countries over the years, I think going back to 1951, if not earlier. So can you just give us some kind of a historical background of how this relationship has evolved until this deal, the point today when we have this deal between the two countries?
Right. Thank you for having me on the show, Sampath. I think this question allows us to set some context, which is very important. The security relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia from its very inception was natural. What do I mean by that? I mean that Pakistan, from its inception as a new Islamic republic, sold itself to other Muslim nations as the new rising star of the Islamic world, right? A state with military prowess that would eventually come, but a state that made its intentions largely clear about fitting itself into the US security framework in the world, right? Especially in the Middle East, right? If you combine that with the fact that the other Arab states in the Middle East, the way that those states themselves consolidated both domestically and internationally, it happened sort of in parallel with Pakistan's own rise as a new avenue through which the United States can conduct its own foreign policy, both in South Asia, Central Asia, as well as the Middle East, right? And this, of course, needless to say, is through Ayub Khan, through Ziaul Haq, the Soviet invasion, and then the global war on terror. But very quickly, in 1951, as you mentioned, you had the Treaty of Friendship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. That sort of foundationally laid the ground for future cooperation. But I would say that over the years, the Pakistanis sort of had to make a case to the Saudis that they can bring a certain manner of training their officers and their military cadre that other Middle Eastern states arguably could not, right? And by other states at the time, I mean the Egyptians, who usually at the beginning used to train Saudi officers. The Pakistanis eventually replaced them, right? And over the decades, Pakistan...
Is that the only aspect to this Pakistani officers replacing them, or was there also a dimension wherein the Saudis did not want other Arab army entities or military entities operating on their soil?
Not necessarily. I think more than having other Arab entities, it was the character of the Egyptian state at the time also, right? I mean, needless to say, unlike the Saudi Islamic monarchies, states like Libya, Egypt, Syria, and eventually Iraq under the Ba'ath governments Egypt certainly was a founder of the non-aligned movement, but more importantly, it was the history of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, right? Which is a little distasteful. I'm saying a little is understating it, but which was largely distasteful for the House of Saud, right? And under Ayub Khan, you've had several generals who sort of reached out to the Saudis who made a better case as to how we can train our officers better, right? And as a result of which, you saw that both in the 60s and the 70s, the Pakistanis showed an ability and willingness to not just train Saudi armed forces, but also fly in their planes, right? Especially over Yemen. So as a result of that, you could see that by 1965 and 1971, when India was fighting its own wars with Pakistan, at the time, the Arab monarchies were pretty categorically tilted towards Pakistan, right? So you also saw this sort of series of examples where the Pakistanis were also willing to place Pakistani troops in Arab states, right? And here too, Yemen was one of the first examples, and then of course you had the Gulf War in the early 90s. But by 1982, the Saudis and Pakistanis really institutionalized their security cooperation through a new treaty, right? That by no means had the word strategic in it, but that nonetheless, I think, was the first time they really institutionalized it. Apart from that, if you remember the siege of Mecca in 1979, there as well, the Pakistan army plays a role, but essentially, over the years, what has been established is that the Pakistanis have shown that the Pakistani security experience and capabilities is something that they can export as, to put it a little crudely, as a sort of a rentier service for the Arab states in return for Arab money for Pakistan's own economic benefit and during Pakistan's economic crisis to help mitigate that crisis, right? This is historic. Now the land...
So when you say rentier money, is it like what, like a mercenary troops
No,
kind of
that
thing?
is why I said I'm putting it rather crudely. But the idea is, since, we're dealing with words such as strategic, that through treaties or otherwise, if the Pakistanis are willing to undertake a greater security responsibilities within the Arab states, there is an understanding that the Arab states will reciprocate with greater financial aid for the Pakistani economy at large, right? Calling it a mercenary group would obviously be oversimplifying it. But in terms of the dynamics of the relationship and who is giving what, I think that is...
So in a mercenary relationship, you give a soldier gives his service in exchange for money. So here a soldier is going in exchange for money.
Sure, yeah. Except here, it doesn't directly go into that soldier's pockets also, although you could make a case that given the Pakistan Army's inextricable relationship with its economy, maybe fundamentally you could make that case, sure. But that's largely been the template of the relationship, and that is historic. In the modern era, as a result of this template already having been established, and just before I deviate from there, I think it's worthwhile to mention that while Pakistan and the Arab states had sort of integrated themselves within the US security framework in the Middle East and the world, India at the time was also integrated with the other secular Arab states, right? The ones that we briefly discussed earlier. India was also pretty proactive at the time. The Indian Air Force was training Iraqi pilots, they're flying fighter missions out of Tikrit, training Iraqi pilots through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? That sort of by default ensured that there was this polarization between the two, which didn't really have a lot of friction, but nonetheless it existed, right?
So when you say India was involved in training and cooperating with secular Arab states, apart from Iraq, what other states did you have in mind?
In my understanding, I think Iraq was the most significant, right? When you look at all of the other states, whether they were involved in the non-aligned movement or not, given India's natural preferences for the secular, non-monarchic, non-Islamic republics, there has always been some amount of military contact, right? This either through exchanges or through limited training programs, right? But it's because Indian Air Force pilots were significantly involved in training Iraqi pilots out of Tikrit. They were flying MiG-21s at the time. I think that's something that really stands out for the IF. It's also a time where I don't think anything that comparable has occurred in the decades since, right? But just coming back to the modern era to sort of round this off, which is the history of the Saudi-Pakistan relationship. In the modern era, a lot of fundamental changes have taken place. I won't go into all of them, but following the global war on terror especially, it's become clear that the main strategic goals, both regionally and otherwise, for the Middle Eastern states has evolved, which means that their needs for Pakistan have also evolved, right? Most recently, as of things stand today, the two conduits through which Pakistani security assistance is provided to Saudi Arabia specifically is for two reasons. The first is Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which has its own history, but it is a war for which Pakistan by 2018 did agree to send troops to Saudi Arabia to help in that effort. And I think presently, as per Reuters, you have about 1,500 to 2,000 Pakistani troops present in Saudi soil, right? But the Yemen effort has its own history. But the other conduit is the IMCTC, which is the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Center. Because you'll remember in the last decade, arguably, the principal threat that Arab states faced was non-state, which was in the form of the rise of jihadist terrorism that was seeking territory, which was the Islamic State, right? As a result of which, Saudi Arabia in 2015-16 forms the IMCTC, and the man who heads it principally is General Raheel Sharif, who is the former Pakistani Chief of Army Staff, and he continues holding that position. So that's because in the last decade, those were the two principal objectives that Saudi Arabia had in terms of defense and security, which is Yemen as well as counter-terrorism, right?
Are Pakistani troops fighting the Houthis or anything like that?
Well, you could make the case that in the past, the Pakistanis have, right, by virtue of their close integration with Saudi troops themselves over Yemen. But presently, the degree to which they are involved is a little uncertain, right, especially boots on the ground within Yemen. But they are present in Saudi Arabia, as they were also in the Gulf War in the 1990s, right? But the idea is this, that this template exists. It's a more natural template. For India, we have grown our own ties with the Saudis independent of this, despite of this, right? And alongside this existing Saudi-Pakistan relationship, which is more natural in the sense that they have less hurdles to cross, right? When it came to India and the Arab world, and India and Saudi Arabia in particular, you did have an ideological barrier that was represented by, the politics of the 20th century. That has changed now.
Right, I mean, that's a very comprehensive answer, Bashir. I appreciate that. Now, coming to this strategic mutual defense agreement, why now? You had this, as you've described, this close partnership, even in conflict situations going back like more than 6 decades. So suddenly, what is the need for this kind of a deal to come where you are saying aggression against either of these is aggression against both? That's like almost like a NATO kind of a wording. So what triggered it?
Sampath, the specifics of the SMDA and how it might affect India is something that I would like to address later. But right now, to take on your specific question as to why now, I would say that this is a deal that has been in the works for about a year or two, right? In terms of from what I've seen, external analysis suggests that it's probably been in the works for 2 to 3 years. If you remember the Indian MEA statement also, we made it clear that we've been aware of this development. It's been in the works. I would say that the specific trigger presently is the fundamental shifts that have occurred in the conflict landscape, especially in the Middle East, right? To a limited degree in South Asia, but to a larger degree in the Middle East. With the template of Saudi-Pakistan cooperation in mind, I could make the case that this was always the natural conclusion of a history of a close security partnership that the Saudis and the Pakistanis have maintained. All you needed was a trigger that was strong enough for them to actually make sure that this effort materializes into something like the SMDA, right, which is the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement. I know that there is this temptation to focus on the Israeli strikes on Doha, and that is unarguably the final catalyst, because what the Israeli strikes on Doha did, amongst a lot of other things, was to completely breach this unsaid understanding that the Arab world and the Israelis had reached sometime around the year 2000, when the Arab states finally showed this willingness to tell Israel that we are okay with the post-1967 borders of the Palestinian state, and we are ready to recognize the state of Israel, provided that you give a commitment that you will also recognize the state of Palestine in the future. Right? As a result of that, you had a 2 decades long process which ultimately resulted in the Abraham Accords, which Saudi Arabia, for all effects and purposes, was almost going to join. Right? But at the end of the day, what matters is that unspoken understanding, because of which you haven't really had a large-scale rupture between Arab states and Israel, no matter the genocide that Israel has been waging in Gaza, right? But once Israel struck Qatar, and another caveat there, Qatar has been a maverick even amongst the Gulf Arab states. So it's not as if Qatar has always been the most natural ally to both the United Arab Emirates as well as Saudi Arabia. But that being said, after the Israeli strikes on Qatar, it became very clear that if a state that hosts the largest US base in the Middle East cannot be protected from unilateral, unprecedented Israeli strikes on an urban residential area in the capital city of an Arab country, then that categorically forces all other Arab states in the region to reassess the fundamentals of their security, right? But that is a larger framing, right? That is to show how things have changed in the region. In the past, you've had similar triggers. When you'll remember in 2019, when the Houthis claimed an attack on the Buqaik and Khures oil fields in Saudi Arabia, which are deep in the hinterland, that also was unprecedented for Riyadh because it showed that for a country that is now looking to economically diversify and draw in Western investment, it needs regional stability. That any actor that shows an ability to unilaterally change the region is not good for the region, right? Whether it is Iran in the last decade or Israel now, it doesn't matter. So those fundamental pillars or those variables that can act as sort of motivations for Saudi Arabia to seek such a deal were always there. Israel is the catalyst. But one thing that I see most people sort of forgetting is something that happened in November last year. Across the last 2 years, especially under the Biden administration, the United States, the number of visits that Antony Blinken made to Saudi Arabia, there was this effort on the part of both the Saudis and the Americans to reach a new comprehensive defense agreement on their own terms. Right? The United States also takes on more responsibility. That deal never came to fruition.
What do you mean by more responsibility?
This would obviously involve not just greater sales of defense equipment to Saudi Arabia, but something, well, this is trying to prove something that doesn't exist, but the Saudis were arguably pushing for something similar, right, that they have with Pakistan, because let's not forget the United States has a number of mutual defense assistance treaties with the rest of the world, right? It has one with Philippines, it has one with South Korea, and a number of other examples.
It doesn't have one with any of the Arab states?
Not presently. Certainly not a treaty of that kind.
Despite having all these massive bases, it does.
Even then, nothing that fundamentally commits the United States to a NATO-like arrangement with any state in the Middle East, that does not exist, right? So the Saudis were arguably aiming for the stars while pushing for a similar agreement. I don't think that the Saudis were pushing for an agreement with terms as categorical as they have with the Pakistanis, but nonetheless, it was supposed to be an ambitious arrangement. And to service that need, the Saudis made a lot of concessions domestically, right? Principally, it was Saudi normalization with Israel. Domestically, the Saudi leadership was willing to be satisfied with just an undertaking from the Israeli side that you will recognize a Palestinian state. And that would have been sufficient. The Israelis couldn't even give that, right? But it's another thing that the Israelis never agreed. But just by lowering their own threshold, the Saudis already took a risk, both domestically as well as in the larger Arab world, right? So by November, Saudi Arabia announced that it was abandoning the pursuit of a very comprehensive defense arrangement with the United States, right? That happened in November last year.
This sort of got upended because of October 23 Hamas attack.
Yeah, of course, without a doubt. That's the most prominent reason for sure. Pakistani and Saudi sources say that the SMDA between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia has been in the works for 1 year, right? They don't say 2 or 3 years, they say 1 year, right? So even if you take these claims at face value, that timeline tracks, right? That the variables that would have pushed Riyadh towards this agreement were already increasing. Iran is an enduring variable, but even the attacks on Saudi oil refineries did not cross that threshold. It appears that once Israel struck Doha earlier in this month, that threshold was breached, right? And the Saudis, and this is a good time to plug in that Saudi Arabia has economic might, but it has virtually no military-industrial complex of its own, right? The ramifications of that are a different conversation on its own, but it would then mean that this sort of an agreement with the Pakistanis was arguably a low-hanging fruit, right? It also wouldn't fundamentally alter the template of the relationship, because it isn't the Saudis who are convincing the Pakistanis of extended deterrence, it's the other way around. But without getting into that now, on the Pakistani side, I would say that nothing has really changed fundamentally in terms of their motivations, except that the South Asian conflict landscape has also come out of an unprecedented near war between India and Pakistan. Unprecedented insofar as the platforms that we use and how deep India successfully struck Pakistan, right, and the number of air bases that we put out of commission. But even then, comparatively, I would argue that look at the frequency of watershed events that have happened in the Middle East in the last 2 years. Compared to that, the South Asian crisis is a far more recent and a relatively less significant occurrence in the sense the degree to which it has an ability to fundamentally alter the long-term regional conflict landscape.
Going back to the mutual defense agreement, I mean, you of course said that the attacks on Doha were the last catalyst, and among many which preceded it. But let's be real here, okay? Saudi Arabia, you said, has these concerns about Israel unilaterally changing the dynamics of the region, and the deal it was working towards with the US didn't come through. Now it's got this MDA with Pakistan. Now Pakistan cannot really do much, whatever threat perceptions it has with Israel, because Israel has the backing of the US. Pakistan can't help you with Iran. Pakistan has not been able to help you with the Houthis, who are free to do whatever they want. So what exactly is Saudi getting from this, except maybe signaling to the US?
For the Saudis, there has been a large investment in advanced platforms for Saudi security without the necessary investment into a military industrial complex. That's far more recent, it's far more nascent, right? It's incomparable when you sort of compare Saudi Arabia's capacities with Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, or even Israel, right? But the idea has been that for Saudi Arabia, its larger security in the region has always sort of been outsourced to a different state, right? The United States has sort of acted as this principal agent in the Middle East, but that has been changing.
Now you're getting one more outsourced agent.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that Saudi motivation has not changed, right? For the United States, it has changed, right? But for the Saudis, what can you do immediately at this current point in time without those long-term gestation periods that anything self-sustaining would require? It's something like this, right? That you have a natural ally sitting very close to you geographically, with whom you have a mutual defense assistance treaty in the works, and with whom you do not actually make the treaty public. So your commitments are also not public, but you publicize that one line, that aggression against one state will count as aggression against another. I would say that among a lot of other things, it does two things, right? To the Iranians, it definitely gives some reason to be more cautious, because Iran is the more historic, more enduring variable when it comes to the Saudi insecurity, especially due to the Iranian nuclear program, right? Which by no means has been categorically removed, right? The Iranians have taken a hit for sure as a result of the American and Israeli strikes, but that long-term Iranian ambition towards nuclear weapons arguably still remains. But that debate is separate. For the Saudis, that was long-term, right?
But would it really make a difference? Because Iran has taken on the US, which is the top nuclear power. So if there is, what you're saying in terms of aggression against one is aggression against the other, and you publicize this, will it really make a material difference in Saudi-Iran dynamics?
In Saudi-Iran dynamics?
Yeah, that's what you were talking about.
Yeah. Look, I think it'll be useful if we take that question later when we are discussing, its implications for South Asia, because that's where the credibility of the agreement will really make a difference. But sticking to our original question, the Israeli attacks on Doha, as I said, one, it altered that unsaid understanding that Israel had with the Arab states. But more importantly, it showed that, and this is an argument that Wali Nasr makes, based in the United States. He's a scholar on Iran, that The Middle East today sort of mimics Bismarckian Europe, right? Where you have this intention to balance against any single source that looks to unilaterally alter the region. In the last 2 years, Israel has managed to successfully bomb more than 7 states cumulatively, including Arab nations, right? Qatar was fundamentally different, right? So for the Saudis, it became clear that if you do not have an additional response to all of these other actors in the region, if you do not have a response that you can sell both domestically as well as regionally, then the risks were only increasing, right? I think the pressure has been very clear, right? And the other pressure that has been mounting because of Israel's campaign in Gaza, that's separate. But the number of sources of pressure has only been on the rise, right? In addition to that, you now have a White House administration that recognizes the importance of the United States having been the historic guarantor of peace and security in the Middle East. But it is also an administration that is fundamentally isolationist, right? That favors the extrication of US military human resources and material away from these conflict theaters, right? So in the long term, this actually aligns with the US interest, right? So
on this question of whether it really aligns with the US interests, Pakistan is an all-weather friend of China, or rather it has an all-weather friend in China. Now you have Pakistan having this, MDA with Saudi Arabia, which is a US ally. So how does it really align with the US interests? Or there is also this entire line of thinking which says that this agreement has the blessings of the US, and Asim Muni traveling to the US and meeting Trump over lunch. Probably they were discussing this. We don't know what they were discussing, but so this has the blessings of the US. So how does it really tally with US interests given Pakistan's military partnership with China, which we also saw during Operation Sindoor, how it works? Absolutely. So, yeah.
In the context of the SMDA, the Pakistani relationship with China and the Pakistani relationship with the United States are not fundamental obstacles. They're not in each other's way, right? From the Chinese perspective, a deal like this is welcome, right? Because the Chinese have strong relations with both the Saudis and the Pakistanis, obviously much more with the Pakistanis. But you look at what Chinese analysts are saying today, that the Chinese viewers always favor these sort of regional arrangements. But especially when an arrangement of this sort has the optics of US security shield in the Middle East having failed, right? Because this comes on the heels of the Israeli strike on Wando.
Right.
If you have that in mind, then the Chinese view is pretty easily understood. Right?
Yes.
For the United States, as I mentioned, that this is a larger US interest in the Middle East, that Donald Trump has always been in favor of regional states taking more responsibility for regional security, right? That the United States will not foot the bill for other state security. That is one of the promises on which Donald Trump won the election. That is what the MAGA camp.
Except in the case of Israel, where the US is footing the bill for.
Exactly, which is like a stark exception, right? Which is what I think MAGA is also now struggling to reconcile. And well, with whatever happened to Charlie Kirk, that was also a strong element in that debate. But the idea has been pretty clear, right? That these are not the United States' wars to fight. For Washington, they have to focus on the border with Mexico and what's happening on US home soil, right? And look at the way that there have been these other quieter developments in the Middle East vis-a-vis US military presence, right? I mean, maybe this is a good time to remind your viewers that immediately before the Iranian strikes on Qatar, which now most people forget about because of the Israeli strikes, but the Iranian strikes were symbolic, they were forecasted in advance, they were telegraphed. But even before that, the United States had withdrawn a large amount of material from Al Udeid in anticipation, right? But again, that was... Al
Udeid is this military base in Qatar, American.
Yes, exactly. But that was still tactical, one could argue. But in strategic terms, look at a lot of the other military bases that the United States has always had in the region, especially across the last few decades, especially those in Iraq. There has been a quiet reshuffle within these bases and a drawing down of human resources, personnel and material, right? This favors both local administrations in the Arab world, the Iraqi government, local militias, as well as the broader strategic interest of the United States, right? Which is that, now you have these states that can take on their own security. If you'll remember, the first Trump administration took a lot of risks to extricate US support from the Kurds in Syria and the Kurds in Iraq as well, right? And the Kurds were vehemently against it because, for them, that represented close to betrayal, right? Of course, the United States took far longer to do that, but they eventually did it, right? And today you have, this situation where Syria is under new leadership and the Kurds are sort of figuring out a new modus vivendi with Damascus. But you get the larger idea, right? So I would say that this fits with the larger American objective that the current White House has set. But in more immediate terms, we will never know. I mean, never, or at least we don't know presently as to what exactly was discussed between Asim Munir and Donald Trump in that White House meeting, right? You'll remember that it happened in June at the height of the crisis between Iran and Israel. So at the time, everybody was thinking of whether, the discussions focused on Iran. But now that this deal has happened, we are discussing whether, those discussions focus on Saudi Arabia.
Now, coming to the Indian context, Bashir, what does this deal mean for India given our tensions with Pakistan, especially in the aftermath of Operation Sindoor, and also in the context of Iran being in the same matrix of South Asia by virtue of being a neighbor of Pakistan?
The Iranian case here is a little peculiar. You'll remember that in June, you had Iranian officials such as Mohsen Rezai, who represent a large section of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, claim that the Pakistanis had offered nuclear assistance to Iran in case Israel attacked Iran with nuclear weapons. And the Pakistanis were sort of caught in this awkward situation where Ishaq Dar in Parliament had to say that the video that shows Mohsen Rezai make the claim is fabricated. It wasn't fabricated, it was just dubbed with English over Persian. So technically what he's saying is right, but it doesn't mean that...
So Pakistan actually offered its...
We don't know that.
No, according to the Iranian version...
Yes, the Iranians maintain that, but after Pakistan sort of dismissed that claim, the Iranians never really made that claim again, right?
So did this possibly play a role in sort of triggering this... MDA, because Saudi Arabia probably wouldn't want Pakistan.
No, I would say that Iran plays a role, but not vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, right? Because Iran and Pakistan are not natural partners either. Let's not forget, January of last year, they were firing missiles at each other's territory as well, right? And they have a litany of issues. Like there's a long repertoire of issues that can cause friction between Iran and Pakistan. Even though there has been some cooperation between Iranian and Pakistani forces in the past, it by no means forms that large bank of goodwill after which you could then look at a strategic military defense agreement, right? Sorry, a strategic mutual defense agreement, right? So that variable is removed. It is for the Saudis, and because of the historic lingering Iranian threat, that it would give them greater rationale to rope Pakistan in to hedge against a potential Iranian nuclear attack, right? So that's where, the Iranian variable comes in. But thus far, what we have is a joint statement from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan with only one line that has been made public, that is aggression against one is aggression against the other, right? The treaty has not been made public. It might be made public in the future. I hope it is, because it will allow us to study it more. But what is the point of such a declaration? The point of such a declaration is to never keep it secret, is to publicize it, to pursue your deterrence goals, so that your adversaries, in Pakistan's case India, in Saudi Arabia's case whether Israel or Iran, your adversaries believe in the credibility of this commitment that you have made with each other, right? If they are not convinced of that credibility, then that agreement is largely meaningless. The first test for this SMDA, I would say, would be a crisis in the South Asian landscape. And when that happens, you would see that these states are not really bound to do anything differently compared to what they have done in the past, right? Because given the history of the Saudi-Pakistani relationship, the Indian independent ties with Saudi Arabia and Riyadh have grown, right? Despite this relationship. This is something that we've discussed earlier. And it is the Middle Eastern conflict landscape where a greater test is presented, because that's where you have this new question of whether Pakistani extended deterrence, does it actually exist or not? With the context of the history of the Saudi-Pakistan relationship, of the changes that have taken place in the Middle East, the brief conflict that India and Pakistan fought with each other, all of those things in mind, look at the Saudi-Pakistan relationship and look at the SMDA. What has been the direction of policy influence between Saudi and Pakistan? Which state has usually been more successful in influencing the policy of the other? it has invariably been the case that Riyadh has influenced Islamabad. It's almost never been the other way around. So historically, it is Pakistan that has been greater in need of economic assistance, going from IMF bailout to bailout, dealing with a near perpetual abject economic crisis, to bend and adapt to the needs of Saudi security at any given point in time.
So you're saying that this deal has probably come from a Saudi requirement which suited Pakistan's current.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a fair way to phrase it, because you see, as I was saying, now the threat is presented arguably by Israel in historic sense from Iran. In the last decade, you had the threat from terrorism and jihadist groups, right? There too, Pakistan stepped up, and before that, you had older threats because of this long protracted civil war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia has been involved in. So to me, or to any observer really, that direction of influence is very clear, right?
So this deal doesn't really have any impact on India-Saudi relations. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that is pretty fair to say, right?
Let's take it as a given that this deal has happened out of Saudi requirement, which Pakistan is happy to sort of go along with because it is getting financial benefits from it. Setting that aside, it also means that Pakistan has a kind of a greater security footprint in the West Asian theatre. Now, should India, which, as you said earlier, we have had some kind of security aid with Iraq in the past, the secular Arab countries, Muslim countries. Now, should we also be considering expanding our security footprint in West Asia in some way? Because we have stakes there, not just energy, but also human labor, etc.
The GCC is our largest trading bloc.
Exactly. So, but we have been on the margins, of the entire framework there, security-wise and defense cooperation-wise, strategically speaking. We have been on the margins. Pakistan has been more towards the center, so to speak. So, why are we still in the margins of West Asian geopolitics? And given our high stakes, and is this something which suits us, or should this change and should we get more involved in some way?
I would say it's by design, right? Because forget the Middle East in particular for a second. India does not have a history of putting our boots on the ground elsewhere in the world to intervene in conflicts and force solutions externally, unless under the UN flag.
Unless in South Asia, I would say.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. But in this case, the reason that India presently follows the policy that it does is a result of a lot of changes in both South Asia and West Asia over the last few decades. But something else that was evident from the early 2010s, when UPA 2 was still in power, this idea of de-hyphenation, right? It became clear that this was a policy that India was following, that India had invested in, say, over a decade ago, right? That we nurture independent relationships, right? With Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Palestine, with Israel, with Iran, and with the Arab states, right? And a core reason why we could do this is because it almost assured us that these states will also reciprocate and recognize India's needs to do so. And they have, right? But by 2015 and 2016, you had an additional change in the Middle East, which was the rise of new leaderships, right? When Mohammed bin Salman becomes crown prince, when Mohammed bin Zayed was already the de facto ruler of UAE, but who consolidates power even further, it became clear that for the Gulf Arab states today, their principal objective is to drive down conflict and not to drive it up, so that you can garner greater Western economic capital for these mega projects that states like Saudi Arabia and UAE have on the table, and that they're not as driven by older ideological commitments as, say, the older kings of Saudi Arabia were, right? MBS presents a very different kind of leadership, right? So in the Middle East, I think that fit very well with India's own economic rise and the kind of partnerships that we could provide. It's not a one-sided economic relationship, say, that the Pakistanis have with the Arab states. For the Pakistanis, I would argue that security cooperation is the only thing that they can provide, right? Whereas for India, when we say strategic, it's very different, right? Look at this new strategic partnership council that we have with Saudi Arabia and look at its different subcommittees. They have to deal with a number of issues, not just defense. Defense is just one subcommittee. Because for us, as I said, in the grand arc of history, this is still a nascent relationship that we are nurturing, right? If you combine that with our lack of history of being interventionist, then I would say that the risks of India attempting something similar is far higher than the potential rewards. And that is while also saying that this new arrangement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is still completely untested, right? Whether you have the nuclear dimension or not is a separate question. But what it certainly does is test the credibility of these states, and certainly Pakistan's as the nuclear power, the credibility of its own doctrines and deterrence postures far more than it tests India's, right? India simply doesn't have an inherent need to enter into such agreements. What India can and should be doing, of course, is leveraging its historic and institutional support to creating, the Middle Eastern order as it presently exists, and which is presently threatened by a single state, which is Israel, right? So I think India did the right thing by condemning the Israeli strikes on Doha without naming Israel, but it's still, the implication is largely evident. But India, I think, should certainly make a greater effort to join the more global effort that is now evident both in the Middle East and otherwise, which is to ensure that you do not have a single disruptor in the region that has this unilateral dominant capability to fundamentally alter the region's landscape, right?
From that perspective, I guess, it's in India's interest too, in a way, if it's going to make for a greater stability in West Asia, right? Thank you so much, Bashir. That's all we have time for in this episode. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Sampath. Pleasure to be here.